When I was 8 years old, my parents left me in the village with my grandmother for a few weeks. She lived in a house on the outskirts of a small village. I was bored there because there were no other children around. There wasn't much to do, and I entertained myself as best I could. One day, I was wandering through the meadow behind my grandmother's house and came across an abandoned well. He was standing on a hillock overgrown with thistles and nettles. Someone threw boards over the borehole and boarded them up. One of the boards was loose, so I took it off and looked inside, into the darkness. I wondered what the depth was. I found a stone and threw it down. There was a long pause, and only then I heard a splash of water. I liked it, and after collecting a whole bunch of stones, I started throwing them into the well. A neighbor saw what I was doing and ran to me. She grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the well. She yelled at me and told me to stay away from the well. The neighbor scared me so much that I ran away. That evening I told my grandmother what had happened. She got angry at me and slapped me, telling me to stay away from the well, but did not explain why. The grandmother uttered only a strange phrase that it was a bad well. A few days later, I started having nightmares. I dreamed that I was walking through a field, through a thick fog. I walked barefoot and looked at my feet. There was no grass, the whole ground was covered with ashes. There was no one around, and I was completely alone. I kept walking, and through the fog I saw an abandoned well. I stopped by it and looked inside. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the rushing water. Suddenly, a pair of ugly hands appeared in the well. I recoiled in horror and tried to run away, but my arms stretched out and began to chase me. I started running away from them. My hands were long, with disgusting hooked fingers, and as often happens in nightmares, it seemed to me that I was standing still, although I was running with all my might. My arms stretched out more and more, and I felt the disgusting touch of those long fingers on my ankles. And then I woke up in a cold sweat. Even when I woke up, I could still feel the touch of those terrible hands. Scared to death, I tried to catch my breath for several minutes. It was raining, and I could hear the raindrops pattering on the window in my room. When I looked out the window, I was even more horrified by what I saw. There were 2 long prints on the wet glass, as if someone outside had put 2 huge hands with long fingers on the glass. For several days I was afraid to leave the house, but when the nightmares stopped, I finally calmed down. I even plucked up the courage and returned to the abandoned well. I took off the board and looked inside. Far below, in almost total darkness, I could make out dark water. And suddenly I saw some movement in the water. It was some kind of shadow. Frightened, I jumped away from the edge of the well and ran all the way back without stopping. When I returned, I told my grandmother about what I saw. She panicked and went to the neighbors, telling them what had happened. By evening, the whole village had gathered at our house. Everyone scolded me for playing near the well, but no one explained why. Everyone hung a crucifix over the entrance to their house. Neighbors locked themselves in their houses, closed the shutters on the windows, and did not turn off the lights all night. Grandma also hung a crucifix over the front door, and we slept all night on the kitchen floor, with the shutters closed and the lights on. The next morning, my parents came to pick me up. Grandma took them to the kitchen to talk, and they told me to wait in the car. They didn't come out for a long time, and when they came out, their parents' faces were gloomy. Without saying a word, they got into the car and we returned to the city. It took years before I finally found out what Grandma had told them. She said that many years ago, a woman lived in the village. Her house was on the other side of the hill. She was very jealous and was sure that her husband was cheating on her. From jealousy, she went completely crazy, and one day, when her husband was at work, she decided to take revenge on him. She took her children to the well and cut off their heads with an axe. Then she threw their corpses into the well. When her husband returned from work, she waited for him outside the door and hit him on the head with an axe, then chopped him into small pieces. She set fire to the house and returned to the well, jumped into it and drowned. Then, for many years, people disappeared in the village, and no one knew what happened to them. My own grandfather disappeared one night when he went outside. He was never seen again. The villagers decided that the damned well was somehow involved in this. They boarded it up and bypassed the 10th road. Sometimes, I still get those awful hands. I'm still afraid to stick my feet out from under the covers, so as not to feel the touch of cold fingers on my ankles. And whenever it rains, I still look out the window, expecting to see the imprint of these hands in the water stains. The second story. That was 4 years ago. I was a visiting student and lived in a rented studio apartment. Everything is as usual, during the day, studying, in the evening and at night chatting for life over a glass of beer. I always went to my house to sleep, it's a habit. That night I came back about 3 o'clock. While I was getting home along the autumn street, the dream passed and I sat down at the computer to surf the internet. So I'm sitting, drinking tea, there's silence in the house. The night is deep around, even on the street no one is hanging around almost. And then I hear a rustle. At first I didn't even pay much attention. I listened. It seemed to rustle at the front door to the apartment, and then someone began to quietly scratch into it. Well, I thought, you never know what, maybe a drunk neighbor, or maybe I heard it. Then I look, the door handle began to turn, as if someone wants to open the door. Once or twice. That's where I froze in fear. I think I won't open the door, but I'll go yell at this drunk. I'll threaten to call the police, maybe he'll leave. He came up. Asked, who's there? Silence. And there was nothing else. Not a sound. Thank God he's gone, I think. Well, okay, I went on to finish my tea. The fear was gone, although I was still cautiously looking at the door all the time. And after half an hour I went to bed. I would have forgotten about this case, but a day later everything happened again. I was surfing the internet again at night, again something scratched at the door and the handle twitched. I was a little scared again, but decided to stay out of harm's way, not to pay attention. Maybe again an alcoholic or a drug addict who is fumbling or someone else. I spent some more time on the internet again and went to bed. The next morning, quite early, I was woken up by the police. Let's ask if I've heard anything. Well, I said that I slept at night, I didn't seem to hear anything special, and asked what happened. It turned out that the child was killed that night in the apartment on the floor below. A 10-year-old girl. They raped and strangled her, and then cut off her head to be sure. Her mother was working the night shift that time, and her father had been gone for a long time. The girl was alone, so she stayed and opened the door to see who was fumbling there. There have been no break-ins of the door since. That's when I was naturally scared. I realized who was scratching at my door that night. The mother disappeared shortly after this incident. They say she got drunk. And now I have a terrible fear at night. I shudder at any rustle and fall asleep only with sleeping pills, even though I've moved out of that damn house for a year now.